Okay, so we're all set, and Mr. Somasekhar Rao, our Joint Secretary, will admit other people who may join us late. But welcome to the 163rd monthly meeting of FOSWL. FOSWL stands for Friends on Same Wavelength, and this is the FOSWL Hyderabad chapter. And this is our 163rd monthly meeting without a break. We are in our 14th year. And amongst our audience today are several people who spoke at our meetings. It's basically a forum for senior citizens. But as you can see, there are very many bright young people also who join us from time to time. And every meeting is an endowment lecture in the name of a member or their dear ones. And today's talk is the 10th annual endowment lecture in the name of Mr. R.S.N. Murthy, an accomplished irrigation engineer. He retired as a chief engineer, and we'll hear a little more from his son-in-law, hopefully, who is on the call. So without much ado, may I call upon Aditi Halbe, who is joining us also from Pune, to read the prayer to kick off our meeting.
Thank
Aditi?
you.
Yeah.
Yes. Heaven of freedom, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where the knowledge is free, where the world has not been broken up into fragments by narrow domestic walls, where the words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its arms towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the dreary desert sand of dead habit, where the mind is led forward by thee into ever-widening thought and action. Into that heaven of freedom, my Father, let my country awake.
Thank you, Arti, for reading that so well. For those of you who haven't met Arti earlier, she is one of the two talented daughters of my classmate Anand Halbe, whom you see there. She gave us an excellent talk on pastoralism, with specific reference to her work in the Kutch area, Gujarat. Rajasthan, huh? Both Rajasthan? Okay.
Gujarat,
okay.
Gujarat.
Gujarat, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So as I said, this meeting is the 10th annual endowment lecture in the name of Sri R.S.N. Murthy, the former chief engineer with the Department of Irrigation. And I'd like to invite Dr. Mohandas Narla, his son-in-law, who's joined us from Paris, to speak a few words and tell us about Mr. R.S.N. Murthy. Mohandas Garu.
Thanks, Subbaragaru. It's a pleasure to join you all and for this endowment lecture name for my father-in-law, Mr. R.S.N. Murthy, who was a very talented engineer who was involved in a lot of irrigation projects in Andhra Pradesh. And more importantly, from my perspective as a scientist and as a teacher, he was a big believer in education of young people, and he spent a lot of his resources and time and effort in setting up educational institutions in India and especially in Andhra Pradesh. So I'm really delighted that the tradition is continuing, and we hope to continue this for many, many years to come. And we'd really like to thank Mr. Subbaragaru for keeping this going. And it's really a pleasure. I enjoy these meetings very much. I try to join as often as I can. And I find them very, very stimulating, and it keeps me in touch with what's going on in India by distinguished speakers from all over India. So thank you very much, Mr. Subbaragaru.
Thank you, Dr. Mohandas. And look forward to seeing you soon in India too. And actually, your son has expressed an interest, a very accomplished medical professional also in the US. I'm sure we'll get him to give a talk on one of our monthly meetings.
He's doing very good work on cancer genetics and research. So I think you might enjoy that.
Right. He's based out of Chicago, right?
No, he's in the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor.
Ann Arbor, yeah.
He's a professor at Ann Arbor, yeah.
Right. Thank you. Good to have you.
Thank you.
As I said at the beginning of this meeting, we have a very interesting topic and speaker, and we'll hear a bit more about Aditi, our distinguished speaker for today. Before that, I wanted to just say, Anand, why are you off the video? Anand Halbe, I'm just waiting for him to show up. So there he is. I wanted to, okay, both of you. I wanted to just say that what a talented family this is. You know, three of them have spoken. So the next, of course, you know who it is. Anand has spoken. Aditi is speaking today, and Aarti gave us an excellent talk. So brilliant kids. They've done very well academically. And we are so proud of, as your parents are, as you know, his classmates, we are equally happy for you both. And thank you for being a part of our journey of FOSWL. Before we start, before I invite another youngster, an engineer from IIIT here in Hyderabad, Sanket, to introduce Aditi, I have an announcement to make. The main purpose of FOSWL is to provide a stimulating ambience, opportunities, environment for senior citizens so that they remain intellectually active. Truly to say that age is only a number, and they ought to be given opportunities to engage and be updated about what's going on in the world in different fields as much as anyone else. That is the primary goal of FOSWL. One additional thing, and as our founder, Mr. M.L. Swami, always espoused, was to build a sense of brotherhood or sisterhood and kinship amongst members of FOSWL chapters all over the world, so that senior citizens come together to fend for themselves, to help each other, and to draw from each other's energy so that they feel their life is spent in an ambience of, in an environment of happiness. And the third element he asked us to add is FOSWL chapters should find opportunities to serve society in whatever way they can. FOSWL Hyderabad has actively practiced all these three. And to give you a couple of examples, we have a hospital called the Basava Taraka Cancer Hospital in Hyderabad, which has a large number of poor patients from various districts in many states of India coming to them for treatment, free treatment. But the attendants who come with them are not provided space or food in the hospital. They usually live off the footpaths outside the hospital in a place called KBR Park. So FOSWL sponsored free lunch feeding for the attendants of poor patients for a month through Hare Krishna Movement's Annapurna scheme. FOSWL members contributed, and for a month we fed those attendants. More recently, in the first wave of the pandemic, we received an appeal from the Rachakunda police, the commissionerate near Hyderabad, to provide essential rations for a week or 10 days for families who are not so well off. There was lockdown. People were not getting any work. They didn't have money. So FOSWLians of Hyderabad rose to the occasion, and they raised some money, and we executed this project through a Freemasons lodge called Lodge Ekram. Another opportunity has come now, and that's the announcement I want to make. There's this young girl who's just finished her 10th class. She scored about 535 out of 600 in her 10th class, and she wishes to pursue engineering as a career. Her father is a mason, the mason who actually builds houses. They hail from a place near Ongole, a small town in Andhra Pradesh. Seems to be a very bright girl. And the fees for getting admission in a junior college in Hyderabad appears to be 1,60,000, which her father cannot afford. So we are trying to raise some money to help this girl child pursue her education. So tomorrow, later tonight or tomorrow, we will send out an appeal to all the FOSWL members and whoever is participating. We'll give the bank details of FOSWL, and whatever members feel they may donate to this cause, FOSWL will aggregate this amount and contribute to the tuition and hostel fee of this girl child. The total requirement is 1,60,000, but some Freemasons lodges, we are raising some money. So we are also putting out this appeal on FOSWL Hyderabad meeting. The details will be shared with you on WhatsApp and email, and you may respond at that time. Thank you. May I now call upon Sanket, another youngster who's joined us. He's from Hyderabad, a neighbor again. He is from IIIT Hyderabad and has completed his course. He is gainfully employed now. He'll tell us a little about Aditi, who's our distinguished speaker for today. Sanket?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. So first of all, I would like to thank Subbarao uncle for this opportunity. Now I would like to introduce Aditi Halbe, who is the speaker of today's meeting on museums, exhibitions, and the stories they tell. She is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. Her interest in material culture, human stories, and histories have shaped her academic and professional careers. And she worked in historical and art museums in New York and Mumbai before starting her PhD research, which considers the impact of entrepreneurship and design on traditional artisan communities and their business practices in contemporary Kutch region. Outside work, she dabbles in fermenting tea and milk and dreams of making kombucha for a living. I believe kombucha is fermented tea. Yeah. So I would like to ask Aditi to start her.
Thank you, Sanket. I think more than the museums, people would want to now Google kombucha and why she wants to move away from museums, her PhD in museums to kombucha. But more on that, maybe we can organize a talk on the benefits of kombucha when she actually becomes one. So Aditi, the floor is yours if you'd like to share your screen. And please punch in your questions in the chat box. We will take them up after Aditi finishes her presentation. We will have ample time for questions at the end of our talk. Aditi, yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Sanket. And thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen now and hopefully everything will go well. 1 second. Can you see the full slide or are you seeing presenter view?
We can see the first slide. You're all good to go.
Great. All right. Amazing. All right. So I have been thinking about storytelling in the context of museums and kind of like exhibitions for thinking about it now going on 30 years. So it's been a while. And though I have not worked in museums over the last 10 years, I have taken a lot of what interested me in pursuing a career in museums and studies pertaining to museums. And they've kind of like morphed and become something else, but they're still very much part of my work today. Okay, so I thought we'd just open with like a few images of museums from around the world. Some might be familiar. There's the Louvre in Paris, the British Museum, the MoMA, the National Gallery in Delhi, the National Museum in Delhi, and the Hermitage State Museum, as well as the museum in Spain. So it's said that the word museum comes from the ancient Greeks, who used what they called museums, which were temples built for the muses, goddesses of art and science. And basically, offerings were made at these temples, and people brought together all kinds of artifacts and objects, and kind of asked for blessings. And so basically, this word museum is already coming from essentially an act of collecting and an act of curating. So there've been museums, or at least collections, that have been on display in human society for the last 2000 odd years, probably a little bit more than that. And this is kind of like what it really focuses on, is an intentionally brought together collection. That, of course, takes on a different meaning when you're talking about something that is collected and presented individually, say, as opposed to when something gets collected and presented officially or institutionally, and oftentimes is kind of used to represent a particular kind of narrative or history about a particular place or a particular people. And that is kind of the junction at which my interest lies. So the earliest museum, believe it or not, and this is actually disputed. I don't think that this is completely solid, but there seem to be quite a few museum organizations and websites across the world that seem to endorse this. Is the earliest museum is this museum called the Enegaldi Nana Museum, which was found in Iraq. And this museum dates back to 530 BC. And Enegaldi Nana was a Neo-Babylonian princess. I think she was the last Neo-Babylonian king's daughter. And she had kind of taken it upon herself to collect a whole bunch of objects pertaining to Mesopotamian history. And not only they did excavations in Iraq in Ur in 1925, I think. And that is when they found not only like a whole bunch of different objects, but they also found little clay plaques with writing in 3 different languages. So it kind of the equivalent of a label, I suppose, that you would see in a museum today. And that is kind of what makes them talk about this as a museum. Of course, what we can't do, this being 530 BCE, is ask or try and figure out what the intention was behind this kind of collection, who the audience was perhaps for this kind of collection. We don't really know anything about that. So for me, the integral kind of like takeaway of this find and calling this kind of like a museum is the fact that there is something that is intentionally, very intentionally being curated and put on display. Okay, so museums as we know them, and by as we know them, I mean museums that might have emerged from private collections, but that were then gifted to a community of people or to the public in some way. You see those museums kind of opening up in the 17th and 18th century, and the oldest ones are in Rome. So here is an image, here are a couple images. The image on top is a museum in Rome, which is the oldest museum. And the one on the bottom is images of the Vatican Museum, which also were open to the public, I think, starting in the 18th century, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so all of this, like this process of collecting and this process of kind of like making sense of or making worlds emerges in the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is fairly like a long period, right, between the 14th and 17th centuries, but we're talking very much about things that had become quite popular during the 16th and 17th century. And you find aristocracy and wealthy people in Europe, particularly in Italy and in Britain and elsewhere, collecting a whole bunch of objects that fascinated them, that they were curious about, maybe didn't know very much about, and putting them on display in either an actual cabinet or in a room where they were just bringing together objects that they were curious and fascinated by. So this is not a curated history. It is not necessary. It's not trying to give you any kind of particular narrative. Sometimes there were themes, and sometimes those themes were just purely aesthetic, or sometimes they were based on objects from natural history that people were curious about. And these were put on display, and it was like showing off, right? Because it was showing off what kind of objects you had access to, where you had found them. You were probably well-traveled, or at least had connections with people in faraway places, and bringing all of those things together and kind of like making sense of them in the way that you could individually. So creating a story, telling some sort of narrative, and that can be totally made up, right? So it could be something like, I don't know, an impression of what Asia might be, even though you've never been. And that may have no grounding in reality whatsoever, but it doesn't matter, right? Because this is kind of like this fantastical show. So most of these collections were private. Most of them were, of course, on view to people that came and visited various individuals, and they were very much a marker of social rank and wealth. And that is kind of where our story begins. Is there a question? Okay. So, wait, hang on, puppy. Okay, here we go. So you have cabinets of curiosity that kind of like take hold of, I'm going to say the Western imagination in the Renaissance. And then coming into the 18th and 19th century, you have something else that happens. You have these large exhibitions that take place in different parts of the world, again, Western world, although we can expand that out if we're talking, if we're bringing these into the contemporary. And these places were basically, it was kind of like the first great exhibition was held at Crystal Palace in Britain in 1851. That's the first image that you see. And it was basically a show of colonial might and strength. It was an attempt at bringing what Britain had from all its various colonies to one place so that their citizens could get a sense of the kind of advancements that the British had made and took ownership of, right? In terms of science, in terms of technology, in terms of art. Basically, it was a mishmash of things that was brought together and placed here. This was the first great exhibition that takes place. And from then on, you have a variation of this sort of exhibition style that happens in various parts of the world. So like the picture in the middle is an image of the exhibition at Paris, which happened in the 1900s. And then what you're seeing on the on the end there is a picture of the New York World's Fair, which was held in 1964 or 65, I think. So I'm kind of like hoping that in showing you all of this, you get a sense of what starts as a group of people engaged in maybe a idiosyncratic kind of collecting and showing off to something that takes on much greater importance and also becomes far more institutionalized and starts presenting findings in the world, or whether they be natural science, whether they be about people or cultures, and starting to put those on display in a very particular way within a very particular context, trying to make sense of their own history and the history of the world. So the oldest museum in India is the Indian Museum. And that was started or founded in 1814. And at that point, what you had is you basically had the Asiatic Society that brought together a whole bunch of objects in precisely the same fashion as was becoming extremely popular and would become even more popular through the World's Fairs and great exhibitions, which was to kind of like bring objects of cultural or natural import in one place and have people be able to view them. And I think that it's important to kind of like see that that idea was already taking hold in 1814, because this is the oldest museum in India. And then you have in 1857, the Dr. Bhawdaji Lad Museum in Mumbai, which is where I worked for about a year, about 10 years ago. And the reason I bring this museum up is because I know this museum intimately, at least I did 10 years ago. And I also know that this had very much, like the collection of this museum has very much to do with this larger story of like cabinets of curiosity and World's Fairs. So this museum actually houses a lot of objects that were made by students of the JJ School of Arts, which was founded just a little bit before the museum, I think. And the museum was a platform essentially to offer the students of this college a place where they could show their accomplishments and show the different kinds of techniques that they were learning in art schools for like vocational artistic occupations, as well as also showing a whole bunch of different kinds of objects, crafts, skills from various parts of the country. And then, funnily, on the second floor, there were these big dioramas, and the dioramas were made, so there were basically these like setups of different village scenes or the different, like the diversity in Mumbai city in terms of like religions, or somewhere like talking about musicians. And all of these figurines that were made for the diorama were made by students in the JJ College. So this museum is not only Mumbai's oldest museum, it is also a museum that is very closely tied to this story of the World's Fairs, and also has very much to do with the process of making objects. And of course, the JJ School of Art was very intentionally teaching kind of like the Western canon of portraiture and painting and sculpture. So, there was a correct way, right? There was one way in which you were supposed to represent the human form, and that is what they were learning. So you have a history of that, and what is kind of like now considered, or what was considered standard, and what we've kind of taken for granted for many years, that was being shown there. So this is an image of the museum. Here, this is the restoration. It went through a restoration in 97, I think, after 1997 is when it went through a restoration. And they consulted with various heritage architects, and it's been kind of like, it's a beautiful Victorian building, I suppose. Like it's, yeah, it's stunning. And the restoration has been done really well. It also has like statues of Victoria and Albert, and this is the first Victoria and Albert Museum before the Victoria and Albert Museum, the one that we know that exists in London today. So this is kind of that. So I'm going to come back to this kind of like take on cabinets of curiosity and what they can do or what they can tell us. Because here, this was an exhibit that I saw at the Tate, and I remember kind of being, I don't know how old I was, probably 19, 20. And I remember kind of being a little blown away by it when I saw it, because it was basically kind of like a mirroring of history that this artist and this installation had done. So instead of taking a cabinet and filling it with random things from various parts of the world that no one had any idea about, but fascinated people for whatever reason, this cabinet showcased objects that were found from the Thames River right outside the museum. And there was a proper like archaeological dig done, and they took all those objects together, and then you basically had contemporary artists who put objects together, and this kind of represented a history, a very local history, and a very local group of objects to an international audience, right? Since this was at the Tate. And that, I think, was maybe one of the first times when I was like, oh, look, you can play around with storytelling in museums in a way that can reflect on something rather than these handed down big, huge narratives of history that we all then take for granted and assume to be the truth. So I'm kind of skipping ahead a little bit over here, but here we have basically an image of a gallery with white walls. And I'm showing you this because what also starts happening in the 19th century is that, well, the 18th and 19th century is that in the West, so I'm thinking about Britain specific or Britain centric anyway, you have visual commodities that are basically the most valued things that are being made. And around this time, you have these big debates that are going on in England as industrialization is kind of like taking hold, and as you know, artisan guilds are breaking up, and we're now moving toward an era of mass production, that that the way in which people conducted their work and did their work was changing. And this has huge implications, not just for like what actually structures our work day on a regular basis now, but it also had big implications for what was considered art, what was considered craft, and later what was considered design. Because these categories are being negotiated and basically debated at that time. And there's this big separation, basically, that's made between what art is and what craft is. And art was seen as the thing where an individual's kind of like intention and creativity get translated onto a canvas or in the form of sculpture or whatever it is that they are making. Right, that was seen as kind of like the highest form of intellectual representation, for lack of a better way of saying it. And that is what we see with these, like this move toward having white walls in exhibition, in museums and exhibition spaces, and kind of having these like white cubes where you just have the art there and the art speaks for itself, and you're supposed to kind of like, commune with the art and think about it and make sense of it for yourself, and kind of like, find whatever kind of meaning you find in that art. But what I'm trying to also show here is that all of these forms of representation and all of these forms of exhibition come from a very specific place. They come from a very specific time. They are basically influenced by goings on in the world at that point. So these are not, it's not kind of like a taken for granted thing that white walls have always existed in museums, or that the only way that you can commune with art is apparently to like, go and meditate and sit with it and get whatever you can. There is this whole notion, there is already a categorization of what was seen as being important, and art was seen as being kind of like the highest creative achievement of individuals. And that is what you're kind of getting here. So when it comes to art objects and art installations, in a sense, it's all well and good. We're kind of used to this format now. We have seen it in different parts of the world. We've seen it replicated everywhere. It's kind of like standard. But what we're also talking about when we're talking about these objects that we kind of determine to be art, is that we're talking about other people and other cultures, objects that actually have meaning, maybe beyond just an aesthetic value. So for instance, these are images from the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And the image in the middle is an image of their African art gallery in the 1950s. And if you look at the image there, you'll see that it's, all white walls, beautifully like positioned, but it doesn't really tell us anything. I'm sure that there were labels, as there is common for there to be labels with kind of like, basic information of what an object might be made from and where it comes from, and when it was made, if they know that. But this was kind of like the presentation of it with no context whatsoever. You can meander through this gallery and kind of look at objects that are beautiful and fascinating and don't really tell us anything about the original context in which those objects were used or why. And the same museum, Brooklyn Museum, has been playing around with its African art collection quite a bit, and has over the years put on different kinds of exhibitions. The two images that are here are images from an exhibition called Global Conversations, where they basically put African art in conversation with European art to kind of show what was happening at around the same time and to create a dialogue that these are not kind of, fully encapsulated worlds unto themselves, but there is a lot of give and take and a lot of back and forth that happens with the kind of like sharing of this kind of cultural knowledge. And so the way that you talk about it, the way that you present it does mean a lot and can give someone a lot of information or very little. This is another exhibition, which again, made a huge impact on me when I saw it. This was in New York, probably 15 years ago, something like that. Yinka Shone is a Nigerian British artist who is known for kind of making these sculptural objects, or these sculptures basically, that he always clads in African cloth, but the African cloth is always fashioned in kind of like a Victorian style. And he apparently calls himself a post-colonial hybrid, and migrated to the UK and talks through his art a lot about his own identity, but also kind of like the history of colonialism and movement and slavery and the African continent, basically. So in this situation, he was invited into the Cooper Hewitt, which is a design museum that's part of the Smithsonian and is in New York. And he was asked to basically curate his own room from objects that appealed to him to tell some sort of story. So the entire room was themed around travel. And he kind of had like a opening statement where he said that, you know, he saw travel as being indicative of desire, whether it is for economic mobility or just a desire for exploration. And he kind of went into the museum's collection and picked a whole bunch of objects that spoke to him, that he felt were telling a story about travel during the 19th century. And the two like towering women that you see here are actually his representations of the Hewitt sisters who had founded the Cooper Hewitt Museum. And they are on stilts because they are literally and figuratively hovering over this particular collection and this room, but also, you know, the museum in it and of itself. And so here again, what we see is really just another take, right? Another take on a particular history, something that may not be fully tangible, but something that makes sense to the person who has curated it, something that speaks of travel and experience maybe differently from an official history of travel during the 19th century, from, I don't know, Africa to England. And that is kind of what you have on display here. And I remember these exhibitions, I may not have necessarily got everything out of them when I saw them, but I remember them having a huge impact in terms of what you can do with storytelling and how you can actually even, you know, shape that historical narrative, right? Like that it has movement and that it's not going to be the static thing that is kind of like given to us and handed to us on a platter, and that's what we have to take, but that we can actually play around with it. And that in playing around with it, we might actually come up with different ways of seeing something that we thought is already known to us. And that's been my big fascination with museum exhibitions and what storytelling can do. I don't think in this case that museum exhibitions are any different from any other form of artistic representation or curation, whatever we choose to do in terms of intentionally telling stories. And I think that there's a lot of scope within these buildings that are often kind of like mausoleums to a particular past and to a particular, I don't know, lineage of power, where you can go in and you can mess it up and you can actually have maybe a slightly different conversation about that time in history and its and maybe even the present and contemporary today. So keeping with this theme of kind of like playing around with cabinets of curiosity, I'm going back to the Bhagavad-Gita Museum, the museum that I know so well. And here are images of a couple contemporary Indian artists who were invited to respond to the museum's collection and to kind of talk about, you know, what it made them think about, or how they looked at the city today and thought about it in this space, especially the space that is so grandiose and, you know, has been kind of like brought back to its splendor way back when. So you have, this is Jitish Kalat, and this down here is, if I am not mistaken, it is the Lure. No, it is all Jitish Kalat. So this is one artist who's kind of making a commentary on the city. So in the image on top, there's basically little diorama figurines that are fighting, and that was representative of the riots in Bombay. But again, like he's entombed them and, you know, made them all pretty and sanitary, I suppose. And that is kind of placed in conversation with other dioramas from when the museum was established that had a lot of kind of information about, like, you know, how to keep good hygiene and what development should look like, having streetlights, you know, huge achievement, very important, that kind of didactic storytelling, I suppose, or aspirational storytelling. And so this is kind of where I want to end, is that when we think of museums, we often, and I think we think about these large spaces which have, you know, objects that have been taken in from different parts of the world, however they might have got their hands on it, which are brought in and categorized and put in front of an audience as if this is the kind of like not the natural order of things, but this is kind of like the taken for granted categorization that we will all encounter everywhere in our lives. But that's not necessarily true. There's actually quite a lot of scope for playing around with that. There's a lot of scope for talking about who museums cater to, right? What kind of stories they want to tell their audiences. So I think that talking about wealth and power is definitely something that museums do, and access. Because I will say that the Bhagavad-Gita Museum was as beautiful as it was in its like restoration, and as innovative as it was being with kind of, you know, these exhibitions where they were asking contemporary Indian artists to come in and respond to the space. That was for a crowd that was interested in art, or knew about art, or collected art, or had studied it, and could come and pick up this kind of like, you know, pick up the story in the middle and kind of run with it, because you could contextualize this within kind of like a larger common knowledge of art and history in the world. But most of the people that came through its doors, and who they actually, like the footfall, the number of people that walk through every day, were not necessarily people who were familiar with this kind of training, with this kind of narrative. And for them, I always thought that the museum could do a lot more in terms of conceptualizing what it was that they were trying to effect in having restored the collection the way that they had, and also in terms of just having you know, having these like artists come into the space and disrupt it in some way. But oftentimes that information was not provided for various reasons, right? And this has to do with how museums are set up. The Bhagavad-Gita is a public-private partnership between the, oh God, is it the Bajajas? The Bajajas and the municipal corporation. And so there's a way in which you are going to be able to speak, and ways in which that you are not going to be able to speak. What is going to be sanctioned and by the government as being representative of whatever this, you know, of like the oldest city museum in Bombay, for instance. And all of that is basically what goes into how museums exhibit and tell the stories that they do. So there's a big difference between museums that do this in Europe, which have a lot of state funding, versus museums in the US, which do not have that much state funding. So basically the way that it works is you pitch an idea and you try and fundraise for that exhibition. And if you do well with that, that's the exhibition that goes up. And if you don't, then that exhibition may never see the light of day or might just like sit in the planning stages for years and years. And so I think that beyond just kind of like a story or a narrative about a specific thing that the exhibition might be about, museums and exhibitions actually touch on a lot more that shape how we understand the world and understand what we take for granted. And that's it.
Thank you, Aditi. That was fascinating to say, in the sense that, looking at museums from a very different perspective. Normally, we would look at it as a tourist, a place to just visit. It's on your bucket list, when you visit any city, but you've given us some different perspectives, in terms of how these spaces are organized, what is the contextuality that makes it, what is the conversation that can be, promoted by the way these museums and exhibitions are set up. So there are a lot of questions which came on the chat box to everyone, some to me privately. So let me just start off, if you're okay with taking questions
I'd
now.
like to just ask her a question.
Let me just take up a few questions by asking you. The first thing is, in this, given that most of these museums are set up by the wealthy, is there a bias that museums portray only the view of the world of the wealthy of that time? Has this changed over the human existence? And in that context, given the digitization and the Googles of the world, how do you foresee this? Is this another power play where only the powerful can, control the narrative of the museums? It's a larger context.
No, I think that's part and parcel of it, right? And that's a huge part of it, actually, is that, yes, these are exclusive spaces. They have always been exclusive spaces that guarded access to them. Even when you had like these, museums open to the public, that started open to the public meant they were open to the public maybe on particular days of the week for maybe particular times. And you had to kind of like apply to come and visit this space days in advance of actually being able to step in. So yes, what you have here is, and I think especially when it comes to kind of like the larger, the museums that we kind of like know worldwide as being these big repositories of like human culture or, I don't know, natural history. It's very much that entire process of curation and telling has obviously come about from a particular class of society and a particular intention. There are ways to disrupt that, but this doesn't ever stop being an elite space. So even if we think about like what museums might be like today, you might have a museum that is free to the public, but for any kind of like special exhibition, there might be an additional entrance fee. So if you want to go and view that specific exhibition, it may not be within the reach of everyone. These are not democratic institutions, basically. They're supposed to be, but I don't think that they are. And I think that that is what makes them interesting. And that is also what makes them that where you can like push back against it and try. But again, what I'm talking about here is like well-established contemporary artists, right? Who've been invited into spaces to respond to them. And the moment you have a contemporary artist show, their work within a museum space, the value of their art goes up. So this is it's a game. Yeah, it's a game.
And the newer technologies.
Oh, yes, the
How?
newer technologies. I think that there is actually a way in which increasingly these kind of like these spaces as kind of being insular holes, like the museum being a space that you had to go to in order to encounter a particular object or find information about it. That has opened up a lot with digitization, because every museum is digitizing their collections and trying to make them available for, if not for regular people, then for people that are interested in like scholars or whatever. So you do have a way that you can give and take. And if you actually think about digitized collections as being just one part of the way that you can construct a story or tell a story, then it actually gives you a little bit more kind of freedom to maneuver, to be able to access the same object from different, not necessarily different perspectives, but you can get different kinds of information about that object that may not just be about, you know, where and how it's made or by whom. So I think that digitization is actually opening a lot of things up, in the sense of this is no longer a space within four walls in a particular location that you have to go to in order to experience whatever it is that you are experiencing there. There is a way that this can now become a much more multifaceted moving story. Oh yes, and someone said here museums have drifted more towards business, far from reality truth, which is yes, 100%. I mean, they've been functioning as corporations for a very long time now. And this whole business of like, especially how museums function in the US, because there isn't that much state funding and everything has to be done by fundraising for specific exhibitions. Yeah, that it's a business. It's a business. Yeah. What gets told and what story gets told and how that story gets told is very much what is going to appeal to a bunch of donors, and what is going to appeal to an audience that is going to come and actually view this exhibition.
There's a question from Mr. Bansal. I'll come back, Mr. Air Commodore Aurora. If you can type in your questions, that will be easier. Mr. Bansal wants to know whether these classroom teachings, in books of history, are they in conflict with what one sees in a museum of that period in those geographies? Are there distortions, of the history itself to suit political narrative?
Right. No, 100% there are, right? Because history textbooks are always kind of like the official history from, I don't know, let's say a particular country that is going to be told to you. It is definitely institutionalized, and it's very much kind of like, it's kind of like a museum exhibition, right? In one of these like big museums, it's doing the same thing. It's sanctioning history in a particular kind of way. It's telling you that this is what is true, and that this is the version of history that you kind of like pay attention to. But just like textbooks, I feel like I always think of this, it's like, how when you study history in school, you kind of learn all of these like facts and dates and events, right? And you're like, okay, these are the things that are important. These are the things that I have to know. And if you continue to study history or read history, you'll suddenly find that that one event, which was so black and white and so clear, actually has multiple perspectives from which you can view it. And maybe much more complicated than just a binary story. But I suppose you start somewhere. So you start with a binary and then you spend the rest of your whatever life, whether it be academic or not, interested in these topics, figuring out that, the world is way more complicated than we believe.
Yeah.
I think. I don't know whether that answers the question, but
well, yeah, I know. There's a question from Mr. S.S. Prasad. He was wondering about Salarjung Museum. You must have heard about the Salarjung Museum.
yes.
A single, an individual's largest collection, perhaps it is touted to be. He is wondering whether it is a marker of something apart from his passion, as is popularly believed. Was it to portray something else?
I have a feeling that passion never works on its own. It's always got to do with a little bit more than that. Now, I can't speak for that particular collection, and I don't know anything about it really to be able to say anything about it officially. But my feeling would be that it may be passion, but the passion is always to do something for the well-being of a greater good, right? Whatever that greater good is. And all of these greater goods are also part of they're learned. It's not, they're not just like randomly floating about there for people to pick.
Okay. There's also a question related to what were the type of, Nitin was wondering, what are the types of objects that were found in the museums in Iraq that you mentioned about, and where are they now?
They are in the complex. So that entire complex has basically has been turned into a museum. So they are there. And they were things like, I think there were some cylinders and tablets, and basically it was artifacts that went back in history as far as kind of like, I don't know, the ancient Romans might go for us. So it was quite a span of historical artifacts that had been collected by this princess.
Okay. I'll take the last question from the chat boxes and from my private window, and then we'll open it up for some people have raised hands, so we'll come to that. This question is relating to the economic desirability of museums and exhibitions in countries of Africa and developing nations in Southeast Asia, where economies are still struggling to give the basic amenities to its citizens. In your opinion, is it wise from a perspective of preserving heritage for future? Is it wise for governments to invest or allocate budgets for setting up museums to preserve heritage of that part of geography?
Well, I mean, I think that part of, okay, so there are two things, right? One is like, what does preserving heritage mean? Like, whose heritage is being preserved? Who's doing the preserving? Who gets a say in what is valuable and what isn't? Because we are constantly negotiating what objects have worth and value and which ones don't. And I think about this a lot right now with my work with artisans, because craft is thought of in a very particular kind of way, right? As opposed to designer, just designed objects or even art objects. So I think that that's part of the thing. I don't know if there is kind of like a right or wrong in terms of what countries should do and whether or not they should invest by putting aside money for museum collections. Because at the end of the day, this has kind of become the global playing field in which you show that you are also a country that can attract a certain kind of tourism, right? That in which histories and stories need to be codified in particular kinds of ways that are recognizable internationally for people to come and have a look at what you have. So I don't think that, we live in the world. I don't think that there's a way that we can not engage in these kind of showcases of power and things like that. For instance, in Nigeria in the 1970s, when I think they had become like, I think it was oil had kind of like transformed the country's economy. The first thing that they did at that point was to have a huge festival of Nigerian and African culture. Like that was the way that they celebrated their economic, strength or security at the time. So clearly this is, and to also be like, look, here is a history. This is a history that we have control over, that we can tell in the way that we want to, that isn't being told by, in this case, some Western country that has access to your objects because, colonialism. So, yeah.
Dr. Mohandas, I'll take now questions. I finished those that came in the window. Dr. Mohandas, would you unmute yourself and ask questions? I'll come to the others, one after the other.
Aditi, thank you very much. It was really very thought-provoking and really brilliant reflection of what's going on in the museum. I spend my time between Paris and New York, and there's hundreds of museums here. But I'd like to know if you looked into the fact that how museums are doing in India, and is there really enough effort made to really educate the people about Indian history and art in a way that is really important in my judgment anyway.
Well, so this is the thing that always this is actually, I mean, it was one of the big issues for myself that I came up while I was working at the museum in Bombay. But it's also, I feel like it's all an imposition, right? The structure is an imposition, the building is an imposition, the way in which this story, this history of the world is being told has also been handed down. It may not be relevant for people anymore. I understand that it has value, of course it does. It's important to know how these different events kind of intermingle and shape the world. But I don't know whether it's relevant for someone that is sitting in, I don't know, let's say, I'm just going to go with an artisan that is sitting in a rural village somewhere in India, how these objects were codified and kind of are categorized for the world and have been. It's great information, but I feel like you can tell different stories. That work is not being done because everyone is basically just focused on replicating these forms of exhibition and storytelling and narrative that have been passed down from generation to generation. And the other part of it is also that that you basically, I've lost my point. I'm so sorry. I haven't slept very much.
No. Thank you. No, I understand where you're. I
that's
understand
okay.
where you're coming from, and I think democratization of art is also very important in the future. So
yeah, I mean, because even if we look at the way that it is being disrupted, again, it's being disrupted within an enclave of elite or whatever wealthy people, right? Because if you have the art world involved, there's a lot of money there. It's not. So who's being invited to disrupt and how they're able to disrupt is also different.
Thank you
there
so much.
There's this museum in Rajasthan somewhere that I really wanted to go see. I don't know whether it exists anymore, but basically it was in a village, and what they had done is they had made brooms and put them kind of on display somewhere. There was a room where these brooms were that you could go and see. And then you would also have people who would take you around the village and take you around the area and basically get you to understand where different parts of this broom actually came from, what plants were used, what agriculture is happening. And in that way, through this one object, you kind of got a much larger history of that village and the region that was significant and important to them and their daily lives. Never got to see it, but I'm hoping that maybe sometime I will.
Thanks
In
again.
that context, there is another museum in Ahmedabad or close to Ahmedabad, which is a collection of cooking utensils over the ages. I forget the name of the museum, but it also has got you can also have a meal there actually with organic food and all. So I think there are kind of different theme-based museums in a smaller way. And so that's interesting. Mr. Rajaram wanted to ask a question. Would you unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, good. Aditi, I was impressed by your talk. A few things that I have some suggestions for you since you're a student of anthropology. Have you visited Australia?
No, never have.
There's some very good work done on the Aboriginals in Australia in the National Museum in Canberra and many of the other cities. So if you get an opportunity, I would suggest you go there.
Yeah, I've done a lot
I have
of
a great
reading.
fascination for the Aboriginals and the
Same.
growth, and
I've done
also
a
the
lot of
Maoris
reading
in
about,
New Zealand.
yeah, I've done a lot of reading about Aboriginal
Yeah,
art,
that's right.
and I know
And they're doing a lot of work
about
now
that.
on the indigenous people. Since
Yeah.
you live in the US, have you been to the museum in Chicago on the Native Indians as well as
I
the
have
First
never
Nations?
been to Chicago. So
Oh, you should go there. It's a beautiful museum, and it's all about the First Nations people. And you would love it since you're a student of anthropology. And talking of anthropology, I see that you're doing your doctorate at anthropology in UCLA. Are you familiar with Arjun Appadure?
Yes, I am.
Okay,
He
because
was
he's
one
my
of the.
classmate from school.
Oh,
And
okay.
he is one of the most leading anthropologists in the world. He studied at Brandeis and he studied at University of Chicago. He's very well known. And if you need some help, I would be happy to put you across to him. He's very
Thank
well.
you so much. No, he was actually one of the first people that I started reading when I got into this like museum phase of my life. That had a huge impact because he does talk about kind of like the stories of objects and modernity and colonialism.
Right. Globalization and modernity. He goes right back to several years. And how about human behavior and how that's judged? He's done a lot of work on that.
Yeah.
Very dear friend of mine. We go back to
very nice.
over 65 years together.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Good.
SS Prasad had a question. Would you like to unmute and?
Aditi, it's more of some information sharing because you've extensively, about United States, so many museums, diverse museums. It was wonderful listening to you. Here in India, one very positive thing I would like to share is the government of India, the Ministry of Urban Development, has come up with some schemes like Hriday, HRI, DUI, Hriday, DAY. That is heritage cities and heritage cities development. And the other one is like this Atal Bihari Vajpayee ka, that was the time Atal for rejuvenation and all these things. See, one is the Hriday and the other is this Amrit. Amrit is Atal mission for rejuvenation and augmentation, like that. In fact, they have even budgeted a lot of funds also. The idea was about 14 cities in India, which also includes Amaravati in Andhra Pradesh, which is supposed to be the capital of Andhra Pradesh. In fact, there we have it's got a wonderful place. Like it's got unique things like which is a Hindu pilgrimage, not only Hindu pilgrimage center, it is supposed to be a great Buddhist center of Europe.
I've heard of it. Again, never been. All these places that you hear of, I never get to travel to.
Right. As an example, I want to tell you that this here is where Indian government has really directionally gone ahead very well. Not only with Amaravati, but many other places in the country. In fact, I was very impressed to tell you with the Patna Museum. It's come out very well. Whenever you get an opportunity, I think you should. So there are only thing is, unfortunately, that things are stopping somewhere. Both the central as well as the local governments should think and do something about it. In Amaravati itself, small place where now it's unfortunately, I mean, it's not picked up the way it should have. There is not only a central government's architecture, Department of Architecture's museum is there, all Buddhist, it was erstwhile Buddhist, it has got a stupa there, one of the biggest stupas in the country and all. See, people, I was surprised that many things started emerging as I went deeper and deeper. Dalai Lama has visited twice in 2006. And the place where Dalai Lama has visited, you would so indescribable, you will be wondering, hey, something much could have been done in that place, a state museum, I would say. So that is a positive side, and also the little bit of disappointment that things are not going ahead in the way in which. And you are given a very beautiful example of telling how that in Rajasthan, how the broom was an example, you said, and supplemented by what Mr. Bala was telling about that cookery and all. Exactly. Unless a museum, I feel a museum, apart from preservation of artifacts, has to play a very important role for education of students and all. The experience has to be immersive. Otherwise, if you just put a board outside Sin Museum, nothing's going to happen. It has to be a total holistic development of as a heritage city itself.
No, I agree with you. I agree
yeah,
with
and
you.
there's one gentleman called just like Mr. I think somebody has just suggested. I don't know if you heard of Dr. Amareshwar Galla. He's the UNESCO chair, and also incidentally he's Indo-Australian.
Okay.
His whole life has been Australia as much as in India, and he's very good. Probably I might one of these days. I think I was just mentioning to Subbarao also that maybe a lot of things. I think you should interact with him. I'm sure that. So that's it. So thanks for my. I wanted to share I was just more of a. Something to share my thoughts rather than. Excellent. It was excellent talk from you.
Yeah.
Thank you. No, and I do actually. It's I don't want this to come off as kind of like we don't need to invest any money into kind of like heritage preservation or even kind of like taking care of objects or spaces that are important. But that's kind of, I do think that that's important, but I also think that the questions that go into determining what gets decided as being important and what doesn't, and how the money gets kind of like funneled toward those ventures is it's a stick. It can be a sticky one at times, and I feel like the awareness that is also part and parcel of this process is worth mentioning.
Air Commodore Aurora, you raised your hand too. Would you like to unmute and ask? He also has to show something. He wishes to show something.
Can you see this?
Yeah, I can see that.
These are collected by me at the height of 19,000 in UP-Tibet border area when I was in army. Instead of Himalaya, there used to be sea. 70,000 years earlier, Indian plate moved from South Pole along with Australia and hit the Asian plate. And that's how the Himalayas came. This whole belt is fossilized by marine life. It's a very beautiful natural museum of the world, unique of its kind. These are small, I could pick up, but there are huge sharks and all, full fossilized these things are there. Second, I happened when I'm a deep sea diver, while working with Navy on one project, we dived around approximately 200 meters down, and we found there is a place known Bhet Dwarka on the coast of Saurashtra. And it's the old city of Lord Krishna inside the sea. It's a beautiful treat for everyone. I believe the government of India has allowed people to go there.
Okay.
And such a unique things are there. They're also fossilized. A lot of humans are fossilized there. A lot of animals are fossilized. Sculptures are there. Inscriptions are there. I think these are the two beautiful natural museums of the world. We should propagate those. And if you happen to have on those dives in the deep sea, you will be able to see and climb that 19 or 20,000 feet. It's a treat to eyes, you know.
I can only imagine.
You cover very wonderful.
She's not looking forward to climbing 20,000 feet.
No, I would be willing to climb 20,000 feet to go look at some fossils.
Good. I think with that, we come to an end. Let me just, there's a few messages here. But these are all complimenting you.
Thank you.
There's no question. So I wanted to leave Aditi with a, since this is a seniors forum, we give advice to youngsters without any charge. And, you know, like to most young speakers at least. So if you're planning to start your own museum or curate one, you know, it's very simple. You can do it at a fraction of the cost of all the Egyptian kings and Iraqi rulers did. Just ask your dad to store all the mobile phones you have discarded from 90s. And they are changing every 3 months, 4 months. Yeah. So very soon you'll have a large collection.
Yeah.
And the first mobile phone everybody on this call must have bought was like that big, like a cordless. And today it's slim. So we want to leave you with that thought that you may actually write a thesis on the museum of mobile phones, you know, or watches. The other day, somebody at a party, a friend was asking, you know, he was showing off his digital wearable. And another friend was asking, does it also show time? You know, it does everything else, but, you know, time is not.
I mean, I feel that way about phones.
Yeah.
When did it become so complicated? I just want to make a phone.
So wonderful, Aditi. From the messages that you can see on the chat, I think everybody is enjoyed it very much and appreciative of what you put together. And it was a delight to have you speak to us about an uncommon topic. I don't think any forum would actively go and seek out a topic like yours on what you spoke. And so we are so lucky that, you know, we could find somebody within the family of FOSWL to, you know, actually speak to us on this topic. And thank you for waking up early. Please go back to bed. Nobody will wake you up. And with that, I'd like to call our joint secretary. Our secretary is taken ill and he has not joined us, Mr. Bose. I request Mr. Somasekhar Rao to present the formal vote of thanks so that we can end by about 8 o'clock.
Good evening to everybody. President of FOSWL Hyderabad, Sri Venkateswara Garu, distinguished speaker, Ms. Aditi Halbe, PhD student from California University.
Can you please mute yourself, the others? Somebody is online.
Los Angeles, USA. Family and friends of Sri R.S. Murthy, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining our 162nd monthly meeting. This is the 6th monthly meeting in our 14th year without a break. We thank the family members of Sri R.S. Murthy for establishing an annual endowment lecture in his name in the month of June. We thank Sri Chidambara Rao M for annual logistics sponsorship for the month of June. Thank you, Ms. Aditi Halbe, for joining us from Pune and reading the prayer. Thank you, Mr. Sri Sanket Uppalapati, for introducing our distinguished speaker. The word museums generally brings to us thoughts of a place to visit while visiting a place as a tourist, or at most to learn a bit of the history of that region. Few of us would have imagined the various facets and nuances of establishing and managing museums, their impact and importance in preserving one's heritage and culture through preservation of physical artifacts as was explained in today's fascination talk. Thank you very much, Ms. Aditi Halbe, for your very illuminating talk and for spending the evening with us. We deeply appreciate your time and effort to put together the splendid presentation. We had the pleasure of listening to your sister, Ms. Aditi Halbe, on pastoralism, and your dad, Mr. Anand Halbe, who took us on a fascinating journey for enchanting Africa. We laud and applaud your talented family.
Thank you.
We propose to continue with the June meetings till further notice. Please continue to follow COVID protocols, however much the situation appears to be normal. Our forthcoming meetings are 16th July, Dr. Prabhu Yellan Pingali, professor in the Charles H. Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University, founder director of the Tata Cornell Institute of Agriculture and Nutrition, will deliver a talk on why does agriculture remain unremunerative. Next in August, Mr. Girish Reddy, formerly with the Goldman Sachs on the boards of Cornell and ISB, will deliver a talk on global attraction of US universities. Coming to September, Mr. Varaprasad Reddy I. Konduru, founder and former MD of Santa Biotechnics, a pioneering biotechnology company, will deliver a talk on my life journey. Good night, ladies and gentlemen, till we meet on the third Saturday of July 16th for our 163rd monthly meeting. Stay safe and you can switch on your mobiles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night or good day to you, Aditi. And again, thanks for joining. We'll meet up again in July. Third Saturday always, 6:15 p.m. And we'll send out the information on the charity project that I announced at the beginning of the meeting. Bye-bye. I'll end the meeting now.